Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Lia Esquillo, IPEN's Program and Policy Coordinator, and I will be your moderator for the webinar. I am joining you from Manila, Philippines. Just a few reminders. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made public in IPEN's YouTube channel. Language interpretations for Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian, and Spanish are available. So you may click on the interpretation button down below and choose the language of your choice. To welcome us all, let me introduce Griffins Ochieng of CEJAD, or the Center for Environmental Justice and Development based in Kenya. He is also the co-chair of IPEN's Toxic Plastics Working Group. Griffins?
Yes, hello, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me well. As been introduced, My name is Griffins Ochieng, and I want to greet you all. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar, Canada Toxic Plastic webinar. And mine is to welcome you to this as the co-chair of the IPEN Plastic Toxics Working Group. I'm co-chair together with you, Ismawati, that I believe is also the call. I just want to take you through a bit more background about the IPEN, the global NGO network, which has over IPEN participating organization in 125 countries. The mission of IPEN is a toxic-free future. As IPEN, we work to link local, regional, and global efforts to prevent harm from chemicals and waste. Yeah, may you move? So in the case of plastic, we look at every stage of the life cycle of plastics, which is associated with the hazardous chemicals. That is one of the core mandate or goal of IPEN, which is a toxic. So if you look at the life cycle of plastics, which is associated with a number of hazardous chemicals. So this is from extraction, where we are where the extraction of oil and gas, to the production of these products, plastics, as well as use, recycling, incineration, and dumping and landfilling, and the global dumping, waste dumping, and also the toxic recycling. So as IPEN, we've been able to document and do a number of reports that give the evidence of the toxic plastics, particularly in the life cycle of plastic, the hazardous nature and chemicals that are released from these plastic materials. So we've released a number of reports from plastic toy additives and the circular economy to POPs recycling contaminant, which contaminates children toys with toxic flame retardants, among some of the POPs under the stock prevention. Also plastic waste management hazards, where we have waste to energy, chemical recycling, and plastic waste, mainly showing how this are exposing the population and human health and environment to the toxics that are released from plastic materials. We work to eliminate the toxic chemicals in every phase of that is from production to disposal. So this is just to basically share with you a bit of IPEN and what we've been able to detect and work on as a IPEN network in documenting the problem of plastic and particularly the toxic plastic. So with this, I want to welcome or take back to Lia in order to introduce other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Griffins. So for today, friends, we will find out the scientific and legal process that brought Canada to identify plastics as toxic. What were the factors that influenced the decision, and what it means for plastic campaigners around the globe? We have 3 speakers to walk us through this topic. So let's now dive into the discussion, beginning with the first presentation. Our first speaker, Vito Buonsante, is a recent addition to our IPEN team as technical and policy advisor. Vito is an environmental lawyer with over 15 years of chemical policy experience from the EU and Canada, plus international experience from Eastern Europe and Africa. He also has extensive experience in strategic litigation and designing advocacy campaigns. So friends, let's welcome Vito.
Thank you very much, Leah. I'm going to share my screen now. So thank you very much, Griffins, for the presentation to set a bit the context of what IPEN does and what are IPEN's priorities around the life cycle of plastics, which, as you pointed out, is problematic at every stage. So what I'm going to do today is pretty much walk you through the decision-making process and the scientific assessment that led to Canada to consider plastics, all types of plastic, as toxic in its decision that came out earlier this year in 2021. So I'm mainly going to have to discuss the context under which this decision came about, help you understand together what does it mean toxic under Canadian law as opposite to other legislation, for example, and look at why and how Canada finally decided to put this label on all plastics. And then just like some brief reflections on what this can mean from my point of view for the world and from IPEN's point of view before Ashley from Oceana and Aileen can dig a bit deeper into the consequences and into the expectations following this decision. So setting up a bit the context of the decision, we need to go back a few years ago. Plastic was already becoming a quite important topic in policy decisions and increasingly under the scrutiny of policymakers a bit around the world. And let's say in some way we can say that the Canadian government had the merit of pushing under the scrutiny, international scrutiny plastics by spearheading in the G7 in 2018 that was actually taking place in Canada, in Charlevoix, the Ocean Plastics Charter, which is kind of a voluntary declaration around focused mainly on marine plastic litter. So as we can see, as often happens, the focus was really on the waste side, on like plastic becoming litter. And in fact, it contained some weak objectives, such as increasing recycling, making plastic more recyclable. Nothing very, very new. However, it did paired with the Canadian strategy on zero plastic waste that followed briefly the Ocean Plastic Charter. There was some consideration of starting to ban some or control the use of plastic, just to make, as they say in these papers, the use of plastics more responsible. So after this process was started by the Canadian government, they started with an assessment trying to understand how much plastic waste there is in Canada and what happens to this waste. And it was a big surprise for Canadian to find out that much less than the plastic that they thought was recycled was actually being recycled. And this was, if you see in this graph, which is a bit complicated, but if you look at the top arrow where it says mechanical polymer recycling, you can see that only 8% of the plastic is recycled in Canada, and 9% if we consider other chemical recycling, so a form of incineration. Consider that this for Canada was like a bit of a shock, because according to surveys done earlier, for a good part of Canadians, the act of sorting waste was their primary environmental effort, at least for about 80% of the Canadian population. And so finding out that that was not really working was a big shock. On top of that, and further creating pressure on the government, was the fact that more and more reports of Canadian waste was being found around the world. There was a long dispute with the Philippines about a number of shipments of waste that were labeled as recycling waste, but they were actually not. But also we started to find waste also in Cambodia and in Malaysia. And really, this was not an image that the Canadian public opinion really liked. The idea of Canada being the country that is sending waste around the world, labeling as recycling, and was not the image that they wanted to have. And so the pressure kept on mounting. There was no day in that period of time around 2019 when plastic was not in the news, luckily. So there was it was a wake-up call for Canada and for Canadians. And against this background, what happened is that Prime Minister Trudeau declared that he would ban single-use plastic using the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So this was really the start of the process of identification of plastic as toxic. In the government announcement, they actually said that not all single-use plastics should be banned, but there would be a scientific process whereby only those products that would be identified as problematic would be included in the ban. And just consider also that announcement was made a few months prior to a federal election. And by the way, there's going to be another federal election this month in Canada, and luckily that commitment to ban single-use plastic and to get to a zero plastic waste is being kept. So going a bit more into the technicality of the decision, let's see what does it really mean in Canada to consider a substance toxic. So there are three criteria that may be fulfilled in order to consider plastic as toxic. And one is like immediate or long-term harmful effect on the environment or biodiversity, danger on the environment on which life depends, and or constitute or might constitute danger to Canada, to human life, or to health. So clearly, plastic could easily fulfill at least one of these criteria in many different ways. And so this kind of identification, if we look at it, it's not really new when it comes to plastic in Canada. It had already happened before, because already in 2016, Canada identified as toxic microbeads. And that was necessary in order to lead to the process that led then to the ban of microbeads in cosmetics. So step one was this identification of microbeads in the list of toxic substances on the basis of their size and their physical properties. And then a year and a half later, or 2 years later, microbeads in toiletries were banned in Canada. So, and similarly, this slide, which is a bunch of dates, is just showing that there was like an actual, there was like a process that was followed by the Canadian government that went from the publication of a draft science assessment, which was then sort of peer reviewed and put under public consultation. Then it was finalized in October 2020, and finally there was like some discussion papers that and some further public consultation, and the final decision to include plastics in the toxic substance list came only in this year. In May there was a publication. Just to go look more clearly at the scientific assessment, I just wanted to point out that as much as we have highlighted as IPEN and in a lot of our work how plastic can have toxic effects in many ways, and also related to its additives and several parts of its life cycle, really the focus of the science assessment was on plastics and microplastics, and most of the harmful effects were on wildlife and on the environment. However, the science assessment did do a thorough review of the microplastics effects on human health, finding that there is yet uncertainties, but in accordance with the precautionary principle, it recommended that action is needed to reduce both macroplastics and the microplastics that end up into the environment. And so, just to say that, yes, all plastics are considered toxic, but it's a narrow definition, and the causes are a bit more narrow. Again, however, I think there is like some important points, and which are in the recommendations, which then will be followed by the Canadian government, which are to further understanding the effects of microplastics on human health, understanding the ecotoxicological effects of microplastics, and understanding better the human exposure to microplastics, which may lead to more decisions that are protective also to human health in the future. But this is really not where we are at. So finally, the decision to include all plastics in the list of toxic substances. So again, here, I want to point out the fact that here we're not talking about the intrinsic properties of plastics, but more relating to what are the effects of plastics then when into their life cycle. And so this is what we would call a generally risk-based approach, where the decision is coming due to the effects and to the quantity. So it includes all plastic manufactured items that because they all have the potential of becoming plastic pollution. And I don't think this should be underestimated. So like the reason why it's toxic is because it could become waste. So can this happen anywhere else? Or can it spread elsewhere? Like, you know, we believe at IPEN like that there are reasons to call plastic toxic, and there are also good scientific reasons, as we can see it here. But the EU already did something similar with its proposal to ban microplastics, and in this case, it did also look at the intrinsic properties of the plastic, because plastic is persistent, and it has some physical properties that may consider it as hazardous intrinsically. So it could spread in a way, but like what we are really looking at is the impacts of this decision, which is the reduction of plastics. And to conclude, I just want to stress out that although the expectations here are for Canada should be managed, and we will look at it, and my speakers following me will discuss this, but you know, from the perspective of IPEN, what is important and what it could also be implied in this decision, or in this initial decision, is like the idea that plastic should be limited because it's the amount of plastic that creates also the harm, and from our perspective is also the additive, and so that toxic plastics should be banned. And we can also think about PVC as one type of plastics that is intrinsically toxic, as well as toxic additives, and especially as the Canadian case demonstrated, like it is frowned upon, the fact that plastics are exported, and finally we have thoroughly documented how plastic incineration creates more toxicity, and so that should not really be the way to go. And with this, I stop my my presentation, and I give back to Lia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vito. Thank you for thoroughly explaining to us the context and the process how Canada reached this decision to identify plastic as toxic. We will be able to engage with Vito through Q&A later at the end of the 3 presentations. So hang on to your questions, or if you have, you could also start putting it in the Q&A box below. So our next speaker is Ashley Wallis. Ashley leads Oceana Canada's plastic campaign. She has more than 10 years of experience working for environmental nonprofits and more than 5 years working in environmental advocacy, including work to safeguard Canada's Great Lakes and end plastic pollution. So thank you, Ashley. You have the floor now.
Great. Thanks for having me. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, perfect. Well, yes, thanks again for having me today, especially to Vito for inviting me, and to IPEN for organizing this webinar. And thanks for that introduction, Lia. If you are not familiar with us, Oceana is the largest international advocacy organization dedicated solely to ocean conservation. And Oceana Canada was established in 2015 as an independent charity. And since that time, we have successfully campaigned to end the shark fin trade, make rebuilding depleted fish stocks the law in Canada, and improve the way fisheries are managed and protect marine habitat. So we've been campaigning to end plastic pollution since 2019, and our priority is really to advocate for policies that lead to reductions in plastic production and use. So as Vito already mentioned in his presentation, but I think it's worth reiterating, according to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is the law under which plastics were declared toxic in Canada, a substance can be toxic if it is entering or may enter the environment in a quantity or concentration or under conditions that basically have impacts on the environment or biological diversity that could constitute a danger to the environment on which life depends, or that may constitute a danger to human health. And as Vito was also saying, the Canadian science assessment that led to the designation of plastics as toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, we're really looking at the impact of plastic waste and pollution. And in the end, the decision to declare plastics toxic was mostly based on environmental harm or potential environmental harm. And the scientific assessment did not look as much into human health impacts or kind of toxicity in the way that I think we often think about it, like poisonous, wasn't really as much focused on that. So these were the two that it kind of declared, oh, my boxes are a bit off. I meant to say A and B. Those are the definitions that led to the toxic designation in Canada. So critically, declaring something toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act gives the federal government the authority to regulate plastic production, use, and disposal. And there's actually a variety of policy instruments that government can use to control a substance once it is declared toxic. So I've listed some of them out here on the slide, things like regulations. So these would be a ban on single-use plastics, for example, voluntary approaches. So these could be agreements that the government comes to with industry to voluntarily maybe change the way a product is made or to set some sort of performance standard. There's also the opportunity for government to use economic instruments, which are not directly in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, but things like single-use taxes, eco fees, those could all be used as part of the toolkit that the government is using to reduce plastic production, use, or disposal. And then a variety of agreements that could happen between provinces and territories that may also have jurisdiction over an issue or working with other federal agencies. So the listing is really important because it unlocks a huge amount of opportunity for the government to take real action to reduce plastic pollution, production, a whole lot of stuff. So as I mentioned, at Oceana, we're really focused on policy wins, so specifically laws and regulations that would reduce plastic production and single-use plastics. So we have been pushing hard for Canada to adopt a strong national ban on single-use plastics. As Vito mentioned in his presentation, in 2019, our Prime Minister announced that he planned to ban unnecessary single-use plastics. Last year at around this time, the Minister of the Environment announced what that ban would include, and it included these 6 items. We Canadians generate more than 3 million tons of plastic waste every year, and 91% of that waste ends up in landfills, the environment, or incinerators, and nearly half of it is from single-use plastics and packaging. So it does make sense, I think, for the ban to focus a lot on these kinds of materials. But unfortunately, our feeling is that the ban doesn't go quite far enough. So if you compare the items that the government has banned to some of the bans that are existing in other countries, you'll see that Canada's ban isn't exactly cutting edge. Many of the items that Canada has proposed banning are already being phased out by progressive companies or banned by local jurisdictions. And the minister himself has been quoted as saying that the ban represents less than 1% of the plastics that Canadians use. And I know Vito was talking a bit about the criteria that the government said it would use to determine whether or not something was eligible for a ban. Those criteria ended up being whether or not the item was commonly found in the environment, whether or not it was value recovery problematic, i.e. is it hard to collect and recycle, and whether or not there was a readily available alternative. I think the need for there to be a readily available alternative for some of these single-use items is unnecessary. I think that if we know that they are ending up in the environment or that they are toxic in another way, the ban can come first and then the alternatives can come second. So at a minimum, Oceana thinks that the ban should be expanded to include hot and cold drink cups and lids, which we're seeing many other jurisdictions ban, including some of the provinces and municipalities within Canada. Lightweight produce bags and plastic egg cartons, and then some of these plastics that we know are particularly problematic. So things like oxo-degradable plastics, which are designed to fragment quickly into microplastics, styrofoam, which is ubiquitous, hard to recycle, and toxic, and PVC is on my list as well as other plastics with toxic chemical additives. In addition to the ban, Oceana believes that Canada needs to be incentivizing the transition away from single use and towards refill and reuse. We don't just want to see us stop using single-use plastics, but move to a different, potentially another harmful material. Oceana's 2020 report, One Word Refillables, concluded that increasing the market share of refillable beverage bottles by just 10% in all coastal countries could reduce PET bottle pollution in the oceans by 22%. So huge impact there by increasing the use of refillable beverage containers. And the average refillable bottle replaces 30 single-use disposable bottles. So we're using just far less material and creating far less waste. And refill and reuse systems can look like a bunch of different things. You may be familiar with some of these in your own jurisdictions, countries. The first example here in orange is one where the user refills their container at home. So this could be from a larger format of a product where there is a better rate, a smaller ratio in terms of packaging to actual product type. You can also, more and more, we're seeing tabs, for example, for soaps, where you get a small little tab. You add water yourself at home, and you can reuse the container over and over again. The yellow loop shows an example where the user refills their packaging themselves, but this time at a store. So in my neighborhood, there is a zero waste store where I can take any jug that I want and use a tap on the wall to get laundry detergent or also olive oil. There's a bunch of options. But this system can also be as simple as just bringing your own jar or container to a bulk store or somewhere where you would get staples like beans, rice, or pasta. We're also increasingly seeing services where businesses take responsibility for cleaning, sterilizing, and refilling their packaging. So in some cases, this looks like the businesses actually coming to pick up the empty packaging and containers from your home. And in other situations, the user has to drop the packaging off themselves at a depot, vending machine, or retailer. In these models, the packaging is essentially on loan to the user. It belongs to the business, and the business has an incentive to get it back and refill it. There's often a deposit associated with these kinds of programs. And there are several policies that can encourage these kinds of programs. This list is not exhaustive, but some of the ones that we're considering advocating for here and around the world are single-use taxes, which make refillable products more competitive with single use, either for the business or for the consumer. Deposit return programs, which help to enable high collection rates and reuse, and refill quotas, which is basically just the government saying flat out that there needs to be this minimum amount of refillable packaging on the market. An example of a refill quota: Austria announced that in their legislation by 2023, 25% of beverages must be sold in refillable bottles. By 2025, that moves up to 40%. And by 2030, it's 55%. And finally, while absolutely the focus needs to be on reducing plastic production and use, there is a need for low carbon, non-toxic recycling systems that actually displace virgin resin. And our recycling systems don't do a very good job of achieving that right now. So there are several factors right now that contribute to ineffective recycling systems and keep recycling rates low. For example, recycled material is often more expensive than virgin resin, and so businesses have very little incentive to choose recycled material. The supply is unpredictable, so if a business actually wants to use recycled material, they can't necessarily guarantee that they will be able to access an adequate supply. There is very little standardization, making it hard for businesses to consistently use, meaning things that look the same can be made from different kinds of plastic resin or have different, sometimes toxic additives. Producers have no skin in the game, meaning that governments and taxpayers are quite literally subsidizing polluting plastic packaging that these companies are creating. And we see high contamination rates in terms of mixed plastics that are collected through municipal recycling programs, also plastics that are mixed with organic material, paper, glass, you name it. and plastic that is contaminated with toxic chemicals and additives. And if that gets sent to recycling systems, then those toxic chemicals and additives end up showing up in unintended places. So some policies that could improve this situation, banning toxic additives and improving labeling requirements so that consumers and recyclers know what's in the materials that they're handling. Legislating recycled content requirements, so it's no longer a decision for businesses about whether or not they can afford recycled content. They have to use recycled content, and if that becomes cost prohibitive, then they may have to choose to use a different type of material altogether. Recycling targets that should be legislated, i.e. set in law, and they should be the responsibility of producers to achieve, and producers should be fined or face other legal consequences if they don't actually achieve those targets. And incredibly important, those targets need to be measured in terms of the amount of virgin plastic that they're actually replacing, and not just the amount of material collected, because we know that a lot of material is collected and sorted, but it isn't actually sold to producers for the use of in new products. And so that's kind of like a high level summary of some of the stuff we're considering here and things that policies that might be enabled by this designation of plastic as toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So thanks again for having me. I'm going to pass it back to Lia now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for your presentation and for walking us through the implication and possibilities of this decision declaring plastic toxic, especially in the context of Canada. Oh, by the way, Ashley, I have a weekend job. I run a refillery store on weekends. So I definitely agree with you that refill and reuse systems should be promoted and supported.
I love that.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah. So now, friends, we now go to our final presentation. Our speaker is Aileen Lucero. She is a prominent figure in the environmental movement in the Philippines as the National Coordinator of EcoWaste Coalition. Being with EcoWaste for more than a decade, Aileen is sought after by both media and policy-making bodies to provide inputs on a wide range of chemical safety and waste issues. EcoWaste is also the coordination and communication hub for IPEN in the Southeast and East Asia region. Welcome, Aileen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lia. Okay, so good day, everyone. And I would like to sincerely thank IPEN and this webinar's organizers for having the EcoWaste Coalition as part of this and share our insights on Canada's toxic plastic label. So before I proceed with my presentation, let me first introduce to all the organization I came from. In a nutshell, the EcoWaste Coalition is a nonprofit environmental health network of over 140 public interest groups. We are guided by our vision of a zero waste and a toxic-free society where communities enjoy a safe and healthy environment. So to advance our mission, we work with the government, industry, civil society, healthcare sector, consumer movement, and other stakeholders. As I proceed with my presentation, I would like to give you some background on waste dumping in the Philippines in the past 3 years. Being an archipelagic country with 429 fishing ports and 821 commercial ports, Philippines is vulnerable to illegal traffic of waste. Among the most recent waste shipment controversies include contaminated plastic waste from South Korea in 2018, the so-called process engineered fuel from Australia, and the electronic waste from Hong Kong in 2019. One of the most scandalous illegal waste dumping incident that we encountered was that from Canada. In 2013 to 2014, 103 container vans of mixed garbage from Canada, wrongly declared as scrap plastics for recycling, arrived in the Port of Manila in violation of customs and environmental laws. The garbage shipment controversy took 6 years to get resolved. Canada's conduct clearly violates its legal obligations under the Basel Convention, of which Canada is a party to, particularly with the provisions pertaining to illegal traffic. According to the treaty, any transboundary movement of hazardous waste or other waste with consent obtained from states concerned through falsification, misrepresentation, or fraud, or that does not conform in any material way with the documents, or that results in deliberate disposal of hazardous waste and other waste in contravention of this convention shall be deemed illegal traffic. So, what took Canada, a highly industrialized country, 6 long years to correct the injustice caused by the illegal traffic of waste from their country into ours? According to official pronouncements, while Canadian law imposes penalties on violations of import and export laws, it does not provide a mechanism to compel the return of illegal shipments to the port of origin, since it is a private-to-private transactions. And Canada does not have the authority to compel the shipper to send it back. We, of course, do not agree to this line of reasoning. At one point, the Canadian authorities were even exploring ways to process their waste in the Philippines instead of focusing its attention on getting them back. Thanks to the vigilance of the Filipino people, we succeeded in re-exporting 69 containers of Canadian garbage in May 2019, following non-stop protests in the streets and in the halls of Congress, and after the decisive action taken by the Duterte government that finally compelled Canada to take back their trash. 2 years after our Canada waste reshipment, we are pleased to know that Canada has decided to declare and label plastics as toxic. The federal government's decision to list plastic manufactured items under Schedule 1 of the Toxic Substances List of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is an important step in addressing the plastic pollution crisis and a meaningful move towards a ban on non-essential single-use plastics that impacts human health, pollutes the environment, and kills the wildlife. So, what is the relevance of this recent news to the Philippines as the possible receiver of waste from Canada? It is good to know that through this development, Canada sets forth to reduce the threat of plastics to the environment and people's health. Thus, they would be producing less plastic production and disposal to the environment. And with the order to list plastic manufactured items under Schedule 1, Canada has the authority to take actions on plastic pollution and waste, including promulgating regulations in 2021 to ban harmful single-use items and address its production, use, and disposal. The SEPA listing is also sending a strong signal to the plastic industry that the Canadian government is taking the plastics crisis seriously. Thus, strengthening Canada's approach to plastic manufactured items will stimulate innovations towards effective circular economy through improved recycling and toxics-free product design. After labeling plastics as toxic, Canada must need to ensure that they elevate the accountability of producers through effective extended producer responsibility and innovative designs rather than by directing investments to supporting thermal incineration processes or poor recycling processes. They should build on this decision by enacting strong regulatory measures to protect inland lakes, oceans, land, and wildlife populations from plastic pollution. And finally, Canada must enact a ban on waste importation and process their own waste. The minister's decision to declare plastic manufactured items under Schedule 1 of the list of toxic substances under SEPA should be the beginning of progressive actions to drastically reduce pollution, not just within the Canada territory, but to its neighboring countries as well. As I end my presentation, I would like to convey the message that no country wants to be the dump site of other countries. Canada may label its plastics toxic, but it does not guarantee that their other waste will not be illegally dumped elsewhere. It is a must for Canada to complement this action by getting away with false solutions that encourage global waste trade, such as waste to energy, incineration, and chemical recycling. Again, thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Lia.
Yes, thank you, Aileen. Maraming salamat. Thank you for providing us an on-the-ground perspective, no, from a country that has been at the receiving end of waste from other countries, including Canada.
Yes.
And also for pointing out, no, that this declaration of plastic as toxic by Canada should just be the beginning, no, of progressive actions.
Yes.
Not just sa territory ng Canada, but in relation to other countries as well. So thank you, Aileen.
Thank you.
So thank you for the presentations, dear speakers. Friends, let's all give a virtual round of applause for our speakers. Okay, so now we have a lot of time. We can now proceed to the Q&A portion. Okay, we already have, we see some questions already posted in the Q&A box. I invite the speakers to turn on your videos, okay, so that we could tackle the questions one by one. I will be reading them. No, we'll go through them. So first, a question from, let me see, Larissa, no? She asks, well, she has two questions. How did you deal, no? How did Canada deal with the pressure from the plastic industry? And were there exceptions in the prohibition established in the legislation? Who wants to take that first?
I can take it.
Ashley.
I can get started,
Okay,
and then if Vito wants to add anything, he's more than welcome, or obviously Aileen as well. Okay, so in terms of pushback from the plastics industry, that is still ongoing. A group of actually representing the industry, including some of the biggest plastic resin manufacturers in Canada, has actually sued the government since the government declared plastic toxic, arguing that it's an overreach and it's outside of federal jurisdiction. So that case is currently happening. Hopefully it'll be wrapped up by the end of the year, and hopefully it will wrap up in favor of the government and the toxic listing will stand. But yeah, industry has been fighting this every step of the way. Their arguments being that the listing is too broad because, I guess, kind of adding on to the next part of your question, were there any kind of caveats given out? No, it is, as is, the listing is to all plastic manufactured items, period. But it's important to note that that itself is not any regulation, ban, or restriction. It's just a declaration that plastics are toxic, and all of those other pieces, whether it be bans, design requirements, requirements for extended producer responsibility, will have to come later in regulation once that, and probably not until the court case closes, declaring finally that plastics are in fact toxic.
So, Lia, if I may add something.
Sure.
I mean, apart from the challenge, like surely the industry is not pleased with this label. The fact that what they consider a clean product being labeled as toxic is not something that makes them happy at all. But one thing that I like to underline on this is that this is a bit the consequence of their own thinking, because the Canadian legislation really follows the industry line that anything can be toxic. Like anyone that has worked on chemicals knows this. Like you hear the chemical industry saying, "Oh, even water can be toxic if you drink like 10 liters of it in a day." And the setup of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is nothing else than this. If a substance, a material, can create harm, then it can be declared as toxic. And so, they're also, I think, in a way, a victim of their thinking. Second thing, the pushback was also coming in the form of the industry asking for a separate act because they wanted to create the Circular Economy Act. Unfortunately, circular economy, which is like a nice concept, is becoming like taking in the hands of the industry. And so their real intention is like, let's do a Circular Economy Act. And so we can manage a bit the way in which plastic waste is dealt with, which means most likely more incineration, more chemical recycling, and who knows if any mechanical recycling at all can increase. Like, let's consider that Canada, according to these studies, like landfills, like about 80% of their plastic, and many are looking at more incineration into this, to put more incineration into the mix of waste management. So we really need to keep our eyes open.
Yes, thank you. And can you also quickly share on the other question about what were the exceptions?
There were no exemptions. Like all plastics are identified as toxic, but as Ashley just said, there's no, right now, the fact that it's identified as toxic doesn't mean anything until there is like a decision. So all those possibilities that Ashley has listed are, I don't know, Ashley, if you wanted to say more about that.
Okay, thank you. Great. Thank you for that. We now go to the next question. Would you know, is there an equivalent to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act in the US law? Is there a specific provision in NEPA or the CWA that would allow the US to take a similar approach? This question is from Judith, Beyond Plastics, Bennington College.
I can briefly take that, but I think Judith knows much more than me about US legislation. US. For what I know in my courses on US law and discussions with my colleagues, I think the Canadian Water Act does broadly define pollutants. So I think there is theoretically a way of doing that, but I think like probably the main problem is like the political will behind it, and then what would the consequences be if like identifying certain pollutants under the Canadian under the Clear Water Act. But I cannot go into a great deal of details on that.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question from Madeline Burke. Does the definition of manufactured plastic products exclude some plastic pollution? Or are these included? Ashley, you said you would answer.
Yeah, I was going to specifically say that once the listing was finalized, once it was posted in May, we followed up with some of the staff that work for the ministry, and they confirmed that pellets and nurdles do count as plastic manufactured items. So the nurdles don't necessarily have to be made into, for example, a spoon for it to be a plastic manufactured item. The nurdles themselves are a plastic manufactured item. So really the listing is very, very broad, and I think could be used to restrict most plastic products.
Okay, thank you. Vito, you have anything to add there?
No, I don't know more than that.
Okay. Okay. From Lisa Huyer, is anyone considering requesting monitoring of plastic additives in human biomonitoring samples to be part of EPR, making industry responsible for monitoring human exposure to protect people? Would you know if there are efforts, or if maybe if even this is a good track?
I mean, this is not related necessarily to this decision and to plastics, but Canada does have a human biomonitoring program. I think there's a biannual reporting on a number of chemicals that are included in the list. So some of them are also in plastics. I think bisphenol A and phthalates are included in that monitoring program. I'm not sure to what extent that biomonitoring program has had impacts on the Canadian decision making, but maybe some other, maybe Ashley, I don't know, or other that are in the call that work more specifically on chemicals can answer to that.
I unfortunately don't really have anything to add. I have somebody in mind who could answer it, but I don't think he's on this call. So,
Lia, can I answer it?
Sure, Aileen,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Actually, with the question of suggesting biomonitoring for plastic additives, first and foremost, I think if it's harmful, even the plastic additives should manufacturers should be using the precautionary principle rather than monitoring it at the first place. You shouldn't be placing it or including it in your products. So if you know already that the plastic additives are toxic, then why put it, and why stress yourself with the monitoring the human? So I think it should be the first and foremost, they shouldn't be putting plastic additives.
Thank you for that, Eileen. Um, a question and also like an opinion. First, is there from Clint Richmond of Sierra Club, Massachusetts? Is there a decision in any discussion? I'm sorry. Is there any discussion in Canada about stopping plastic recycling? Because if plastic is toxic before use, then you know the toxic chemicals get recycled too.
I would say that there are some environmental groups for sure that are making very clear and trying to make a lot of noise about the fact that if we are sorry, the federal government talks a lot about this vision of a circular economy. And as I know, we've touched on it a few different points in this presentation, and I think this is what your question's getting at. A circular economy is all great in theory, but if we're just circulating toxic chemicals and we're recycling materials that have toxic chemicals, either knowingly or unknowingly, you're going to end up kind of dispersing those toxic chemicals into places that you may not have intended, and not that they should be in any product, but they could have even worse impacts depending on where they're ending up. So there is definitely a group of environmental nonprofits and environmental groups that are really bringing that statement forward. But in general, I would say there is still a lot of talk about recycling. And from a policy perspective, we're seeing the current government and like political parties that are kind of vying for more power, really talking about recycling as being the primary solution. And the environmental groups are trying to kind of mount this narrative that recycling, yes, will be a part of the solution, but there's a bunch of things that we need to change to get it right. And really what we need to be doing is to be reducing plastic use overall. But I wouldn't say that that's a narrative that the government has really picked up on yet.
Thank you, Ashley. Okay. Vito, you wanted to say something? No.
No, in relation, if the question was like made in relation to the decision, and the point of the decision is like to declare toxic the plastic because they can potentially become pollution, and the consequences of this is like in the perspective of the Canadian legislation is, okay, there is this potential that becomes pollution. We should consider some risk management measures to avoid that it becomes pollution, rather than banning plastics altogether. It's very unlikely that that happens. The Canadian government keeps on giving a lot of money to petrochemical companies to make even more plastics. So it's a bit of a like a end of pipe perspective.
Yeah.
The Canadian one.
Okay. On that still, a question from Bjorn. How are chemical additives addressed in the new Canadian regulation? Is it addressed at all? How do they?
So if you don't mind, Ashley, like I can start with this. The thing is that the additives, the science assessment looks at additives mainly from the perspective of how they can attach to microplastic and create pollution, and in that sense. There is discussion about the fact that additives are added to plastics without binding to the plastic itself, so they can leach. But it was not the central. It is not central to this. Like in the end, like the perspective of the science, from the science assessment point of view, there's two main points. One is like there are physical impacts of macroplastics, being primarily that they are ingested by wildlife, and there can be entanglement from a wildlife perspective, and birds and other animals can die out of it. And second is like, okay, there are emerging microplastic. We're understanding more on the impacts, and microplastic can be vectors for additive chemical. So in that perspective, additives are important, but they are not central to this decision yet. And I'm hoping that as we further our understanding on microplastics, then more decisions related to the additives will come.
Yeah, I would maybe also just add, so kind of taking a step back again, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is the piece of legislation that has been around since 1999. The list of toxic substances is kind of a growing list that microplastics were added to a few years ago, and that now plastic manufactured items have been added to. And what Vito was saying about how the plastic manufactured listing was really focused kind of on plastic as like just like a thing, like one singular thing. But there are some additives that are added to plastic, which are on the toxic substance list, but were added like years ago. Things like bisphenol A, BPA. And there could be an opportunity to, in parallel, like as we're developing regulations that kind of focus on plastic as a potential waste, plastic as it can become something that an animal can ingest or get entangled in, we could also in parallel be advocating for further restrictions on some of those additives. So we could do that together as part of the plastics, the regulations that will come from the listing of plastic manufactured items, or we can kind of go down one path with the plastic manufactured items and also be focused on individually adding a bunch of additives that we know are harmful to the list of toxic substances, and then setting restrictions and regulations, et cetera, for those substances. I don't know if that made it clearer, but
yeah, I understood. Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question on that from the participant. Can you quickly also clarify the definition between microplastic and macroplastic?
Microplastic is smaller than 5 millimeters, and macroplastic is anything larger than that.
Okay, thank you. A sharing and a question from Indonesia, from M. Lazuardi. In Indonesia, the declaration as toxic waste means that regulation regarding toxic waste will be enforced on the waste. No? So it includes regulation on transportation, that it must be licensed, a dedicated license if you produce it, use it, or process it. Perhaps there's a difference no, in the regulation difference in the regulation between Canada and Indonesia. But can you see, the question is, can you see that the declaration of toxic on plastic could expose recycling to certain restrictions that, for example, the price could skyrocket in the future?
I don't think so. I mean, there are other provisions, and I am by no means like a Canadian environmental lawyer, like, so I do know a bit, but not. But there are other provisions that deal with the management of hazardous waste. There are permitting related to hazardous waste management in Canada. Like this, this really looks at. Although I know it could be confusing, although it has a perspective that is based on end of pipe legislation, this kind of legislation, I mean, it can mean anything. Like Ashley in one of her slides was put like down a list of the many risk management measures that can be carried out, and it could be it is very broad, and it can go from like banning one specific item that creates more pollution to banning one type of plastics. Like it's very open. It's not I you know, as we've seen, as the ambition is not going to be very, very high, most likely, but it's surely the Canadian government is not going to do anything to put itself in the way of recycling, which is already challenging.
Thank you. Gilbert seems to agree with you. He says from Cameroon, I have the impression that all the solutions envisaged after the scientific evaluation by Canada is more like to keep plastic in the economy rather than solve the problem that plastic is. What do you think about this, Ashley?
Yeah, I think that's like literally the messaging that the government has used. Like they often say, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think it's like $9 billion worth of plastic in Canada are thrown out every year, which is a huge like economic loss. Let's do a better job of collecting that plastic and keeping it in the economy. So yeah, I don't think that they're definitely not focused on what we can do to reduce plastic production. Canada is a oil producing country. 99% of plastics come from fossil fuels. As of right now, there's strong incentive for us to keep using plastic. And I think ideally what the government wants to do is just do a better job of keeping it out of the environment and out of landfills. My job is to try to convince them that that is insufficient.
Yeah. Yes. Indeed. Yeah. Another quick question. Is the Canadian assessment, the scientific assessment, is it available online? Is there a link that people can?
Yep, we can share that with you afterwards, but it's publicly available. So is a discussion paper that the federal government released last fall outlining some potential directions for policy and the actual toxic substance listing. The thing that Vito said was proposed on or finalized on May 12th that goes into the details of why the government went ahead and declared plastic toxic. We can make sure that that's linked out to the group if
Yes.
I can share those links with you.
Yes, please. That would be very helpful. Great. Actually, I'm sorry, friends. That's all the time we have in the Q&A. But let me call on Bjorn. He said he wanted to share something.
Great. I want to thank Vito, Ashley, and Aileen for the great presentation in raising some broader awareness about the Canadian regulation. And as you can see, a lot of the details is that this is a bit more of a waste-focused approach, and the harm is more articulated in harm to the environment than to human health. Nonetheless, I just want to stress for everyone that this is a very powerful communication opportunity. The fact that Canada has now created a new law that regulates plastics as a toxic substance is one that could be pointed to as a message. IPEN does use the term toxic plastics. That can be quite confusing because scientifically, when you break down the definition of plastic, we are really focusing on the additives. But that said, in using that language of that Canada has a new law regulating plastics as a toxic substance is powerful and one that can be leveraged in your communication tools, whether you're in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. So I just want to frame it that way. And that also puts the industry, who was very unhappy about this because it puts a toxic brand on their material. It puts them on the defense to begin to try to articulate, no, it's not toxic. It's actually a recyclable material. It changes the framing. So I just wanted to share that with the group in a way of how do you communicate the problems with the plastics, especially with the idea of the chemical additives, not the idea, but the reality of the chemical additives, which seems to be a challenge for us still in elevating this because most of the regulation is focused so much on the visible waste side. And then it enters quickly into a paradigm of microplastics. And so with that, I just do want to, before I conclude, foreshadow that we will be doing another webinar soon regarding microplastics and why microplastics are not the story. So just a little plug there for the next upcoming webinar. Thank you, Lia.
Great. Thank you also for your input, Bjorn. Thank you. So again, friends, I'm sorry. We have to end the question and answer portion, but thank you for all the questions, dear attendees. It surely added depth to the discussion, everyone's questions and further inputs. Before we end, I would like to request everyone, the attendees, to kindly fill up. There will be a survey form after this session. It will pop up automatically and get to your inbox. So it's very short. Your answers will provide important feedback for us to improve our future IPEN webinars. So thank you for that. Before we go to the closing remark, can we all just say thank you again to our three fine speakers and give them again another virtual round of applause. So thank you, Vito, Ashley, and Aileen. Okay.
Thank you, Lia.
You're welcome. So friends, we hope you found today's webinar helpful for your work and your interests. We will now call on the other co-chair of IPEN's Toxic Plastic Working Group. We would like to call on Yuyun Ismawati from Nexus 3. They're operating in Indonesia. Yuyun?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lia. And thank you, Vito, Ashley, and Aileen for an excellent presentations. I mean, it's really interesting to see the intertwine between the background of the Canada regulations and then the impact to the ocean and environment, and also the return of the shipment that took 6 years. Bjorn already explained about the toxic plastics that we use in our working group. At the beginning, we also discuss whether we will be bold saying that our working group is toxic plastic working group or only plastic working group. We said, nah, let's go toxic plastics. So when we welcome the Canada regulations in labeling plastic as toxic, we thought that this is a good start, because we at least have one country brave enough to launch and declare the regulation to label plastic as toxic. So I think we are in line with the trend in the future, we hope. And as the discussions within the Stockholm Convention, Basel and Basel Conventions negotiation, plastics already categorized, certain type of plastics categorized as toxics and cured and so on and so on. So that has already provided the pathways towards labeling plastics as toxics. So I think there are some issues that have already mentioned before by one of the attendees, asking about different regulations between the trade partners countries like Indonesia, because different regulations will apply different mechanism. So I don't know whether in the future the trade agreement, especially plastic waste from Canada with other countries, will need some adjustments. Announcements should be made by Canada to WTO, because now if plastic has been labeled as toxic by Canada, it means trade could be different. The treatment for plastic waste trade could be different. I missed the first part of the presentations of Vito, so I don't know how the government of Canada will treat the petrochemical industry, whether there are going to be, disincentives or more tax, or how. And also, I'm wondering whether these toxic plastics also connected to the net zero plan of Canada, because that will be interesting to see when plastics already labeled as toxic by Canada. The next step is to look at the petrochemicals and the upstream sector. So to close, I just want to emphasize that at IPEN Toxic Plastic Working Group, we support and promote the control, international control on plastics as a whole life cycle. So it's not only the downstream of plastics as waste, but also at the upstream. So hopefully more countries will follow Canada. And let's keep doing our works. And there are lots of things to dig, and evidence and facts, data need to be generated to support this position for plastics as toxic. Thank you so much, IPEN, Lia, for convening this webinar, and also thanks to all of the interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuyun. And yes, friends, indeed, as Yuyun said, there's a lot of things still to discuss and to do. So watch out, because we have a number of webinars coming up on the toxics in the life cycle of plastic. So watch out for that. And I also typed in the chat box our page for the resources on the IPEN Toxics Plastics info page of IPEN. So check it out, and maybe the resources might be helpful for your work too. Okay, again, thank you everyone. Thank you for joining today. May you all keep safe, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Lia. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.